Greetings friends, and welcome to my guide on Paladin tanking. This is going to be a two-part guide covering cross-class abilities, equipment and stats, and finally, ability cooldowns and DPS techniques. This information is aimed mostly towards players at max level. However, it can also be a good resource for new players that are looking to eventually get into in-game content. Paladins are an amazing tanking class with many utility skills and party supporting abilities. Paladins are an easy job to play, requiring a low to moderate skill cap to master, but that is in no way saying that their simple makeup takes away from their usefulness or the enjoyment. I am a theory crafter at heart that takes every opportunity to improve his overall performance in any given situation. I will never claim to be the best, and I'm always willing to learn new things, so if you have a legitimate suggestion on something I have missed or perhaps am ignorant to, please leave me a comment below or message me in game. I am Xenosis Vex on Sargatanas. Let's Paladin this shit up. Okay, first things first, cross-class abilities. Now there is only one cross-class ability that I think should be a part of every Paladin's arsenal, and the rest are just for minor utility. For the most part, these cross-class abilities are personal preference and situational. The Paladin's main abilities are already extremely good, making their cross-class skills pretty mediocre at best. The first cross-class ability that I would recommend is definitely Stone Skin. Stone Skin creates a barrier around the target that absorbs damage totaling 10% of the target's maximum HP. Stone Skin is almost like having an additional cooldown if casted before big attacks or high damaging mechanics. You can also cast this on other party members as well. Getting this spell will definitely improve your tanking and supporting capabilities. Now the rest are more personal preference as I stated earlier, but I will tell you which ones I use and why. The next is Foresight. Foresight increases defense by 20% for 20 seconds. The cooldown is 2 minutes. This is a pretty shitty defensive cooldown when it comes to mitigation, however it does provide some. I really like activating this skill in between high damaging mechanics to help soften the moderate damaging abilities in between, or I'll pair this skill up with other cooldowns to help mitigate mechanic damage. Next is Bloodbath. Bloodbath converts 25% of the damage you deal into HP for 15 seconds with a 90-second cooldown. For Paladin, this skill is barely noticeable on its own given that it is only 15 seconds, so I think it is best used in combination with another cooldown. I take Fracture next because it is a slight DPS increase. Fracture is a 220 potency attack lasting over 18 seconds. This skill is really good to apply as the boss disappears or before a tank swap, so you can continue to DPS without having to worry about pulling threat after the provoke. It also gives you a break from 1-2-3 Rage of Alone combo. For my final cross-class ability, I take another DPS skill, Mercy Stroke. It is a finisher type move that can only be executed when the target's HP threshold is below 20%. It delivers a 200 potency attack off the global cooldown, and while rarely relevant, if you get the killing blow with this move, it will heal you for 20% of your maximum HP. The cooldown is 90 seconds. Now I'll go over the ones I have not mentioned. Skull Sunder. No. Please. Just no. Never take this move. Cure is severely outclassed by Stone Skin, and Stone Skin will grant you more EHP than Cure can heal by a significant margin. Plus, if you're casting Cure, then you cut down on the amount of times you can cast Stone Skin, so it's not optimal to cast Cure at all. Raise isn't viable because you cannot use this in combat, unfortunately. If you could use this in combat, I would say this would be a definite cross-class ability. And last but not least, Protect. Protect is viable and a good choice. I think it provides a lot of support for if someone dies and the healers are busy or low on mana. I personally do not use this ability because my healers never need me to and would rather me doing more damage. So subbing out a DPS cross-class ability for Protect is definitely an option too. Okay, let's go over stats in their priority order now. After achieving accuracy cap, which is currently 512 at patch 2.38, you should prioritize your stats like this: Vit, Strength, Det, Crit, and skill speed. I will go into the scaling of these stats based on the tests myself and others have done. Now do not take this as 100% accurate, because I'm sure with more testing and further updates this may prove to be slightly over or under, but I have found that the information collected is still really good to use as a guide when trying to min-max and optimize your character. For Paladin, Vitality scales at around 14.4 HP per point, give or take a point, depending on how high or low your total Vitality is. This will be your primary stat over everything else, to a certain extent. Once the appropriate HP threshold is reached, Vitality will start to lose its effectiveness. This threshold is based on the skill of the player, the gear the player has, and the encounter. So as you can see, there is no definite answer to match all encounters in the game, but for the sake of keeping it simple, up to patch 2.38 of course, I will suggest that if you have at least 7,500 HP not in party, it is safe for you to start focusing all your points into strength. Strength. Strength is an amazing stat for tanks, and I do not think people give it as much credit as it deserves. Strength helps mitigate damage upon a successful block and parry, so having more strength will not only increase your damage dealt, but also your tanking capabilities. Strength does double duty for Paladins, so prioritizing strength after a certain HP threshold is reached is a really good route to go. I've had a lot of trouble finding the scaling for strength because there are several other factors that contribute besides the actual stat itself. But I believe that 5.5 per strength is 1% weapon skill increase, and that is a good guideline and consistent that I have found. Determination. For Paladin, this stat affects the amount of damage dealt by your abilities and auto attack potency, and if for whatever reason you decide to take Cure as a cross class, Determination affects it as well. But for physical damage, think of it like a shitty strength. It scales a little better than crit at roughly 4.5 per 1 strength, so because this is guaranteed damage with no RNG involved, you'll want to try to get as much gear with dead on it as possible. Critical hit rate. Crit rate scales at around 5.6 per 1 strength, so a little less than dead, but still really important. The crit damage and healing modifier is a set value multiplier of 1.5 times. However, there are other modifiers and factors that come into play, but for the sake of keeping it simple, if your normal attack is 500, you can expect that this crit attack will be for 750. This is another really good stat that you'll want a shit ton of. Skill speed. Skill speed doesn't have a direct impact on your damage output like dead and crit, meaning that you will not notice it as much. It kind of works behind the scenes in a sense, increasing your overall DPS throughout the entirety of the fight. In comparison to strength, it scales around 5.2 per 1 strength. However, for every 100 skill speed, you only gain 1 extra attack in 60 seconds of non-interrupted damage on the boss. That's pretty god-awful if you ask me, considering a lot of encounters in this game involve the boss disappearing. However, getting that last hit in before the boss disappears is always pretty sweet, especially if it is to refresh a dot. While skill speed does not directly affect switching oaths, it does help prevent having to switch oaths mid-combo by attacking faster. Now I know what you're thinking. This guy's an idiot! He forgot about parry and block! And those are the most important stats! What a moron! Well, I didn't. Now I'll dive into parry and block. I wanted to save parry and block for last because I'm really going to go deep into parry and how to tank in Final Fantasy XIV. Block on the other hand is forced and really needs very little explaining. Parry. Parry is an awful stat in this game because of the scaling and the tanking meta. Through tests of my own and others have done, I have concluded that parry scales at a very low rate point for point. On average, I only gain 1% parry rate for every 100 points of parry. Again, that number may not be 100% accurate, but after many tests, it is a good guideline to go off of. I'm going to take a second to explain what I mean when I say tanking meta. As I stated earlier in this guide, the tanking meta calls for big, predictable hits that are incorporated into high damaging mechanics. Here are some examples: Raven's Beak, Death Sentence, and Mountain Buster. You guys get the idea. Final Fantasy XIV isn't designed to rely on parry like in other MMOs. Just because a tank stat exists does not mean it is good or optimal. I'm going to repeat this. Just because a tank stat exists does not mean it is good or optimal. Now, let that sink in for a sec and follow me on this. Try not to think of tanking in terms of stats, but how the actual damage from the boss is produced. If the boss is not hitting you with mechanic damage, meaning abilities that hit hard enough that will kill you unless you activate a defensive cooldown, then it is all fluff damage. It's a pillow fight. So in a sense, if you parry the fluff damage, it doesn't matter because the incoming heal will cover the damage regardless of the outcome. The same goes for mechanic damage. Now even if you parry the attack, you should have already prepared for it by properly activating defensive cooldowns, so the parry will ultimately not matter. There are always exceptions to this though. Like for instance, if the healer is dead or behind on heals, then the parry will be much more noticeable. However, in Final Fantasy XIV, you do not tank damage with RNG based stats. You mitigate it with cooldowns. That's how you manage it. Does parry help? Of course. But is it needed and worth stacking? In my opinion, no, because you sacrifice all the other stats that can provide you with so much more. A lot of arguments I get against my initial stand on parry not being optimal is, your main job is to tank, and you should provide as much mitigation as possible. Now, that may sound correct at first, but I believe that is an extremely incorrect and ignorant mentality related to this particular game. Let me explain. Stacking tank stats are key for tanking, obviously. However, in this game, no tank stats other than Vit and Strength are a main stat. Dexterity does not count. Parry is not a main stat, it is a secondary stat that scales horribly. I strongly believe that if you removed parry completely from the game as it currently is, it would change very little. You would take more fluff damage some of the time. That's the extent. It would not change any encounters, and you would still pop all the same cooldowns as you normally would for mechanic damage. In addition to this, and what a lot of people don't think about, a lot of moves and abilities in Final Fantasy XIV are magic based that you might not think about. And believe it or not, magic based attacks are a serious business. Here's some examples. Basically every attack Rama does: Raven's Ascent, Mega Flare, Dread Tide, Defensive Reaction, Landmines, Diffusion Ray, etc., etc. And you cannot parry any of these. If more mechanic damage were based around multiple hits spread across a lot of damage instead of just one massive hit, parry would be a lot more valuable and effective. I'll use this example. Let's say that Death Sentence hits for 8k. However, that 8k damage was spread across 4 hits of 2k. Now we're talking parry being awesome. 4 different chances to trigger. Doesn't that sound much more effective than having only one chance to parry or block an attack? I believe that a shift in the meta could make parry an amazing stat, but as it is now, I don't believe it's worth stacking. Block. Block is awesome and a lot better than parry because it is built into the Paladin class without having to stack or sacrifice any other stats to increase its effectiveness, which is absolutely amazing because it is free mitigation. In addition, you have a cooldown in the form of Bulwark to bolster its effectiveness, making it much more reliable. The scaling of block rate versus block strength will actually not matter unless there is horizontal progression, meaning there will be multiple gear options to choose from other than one that is just the highest item level. I'll explain that a little later in this guide when I get into equipment. However, you must always be conscious that RNG can screw you over, so do not set yourself up to fail. Use appropriate cooldowns when mechanic damage is coming. So, to sum up parry and block. Well, block is amazing, and I love block. Free mitigation with absolutely no downside. On parry, however, I am aware of the many different opinions, and while I am somewhat biased, I will agree with everyone that if you choose to stack parry, that is 100% appropriate, and you will be able to clear all the encounters in the game, assuming you have the required skill to do so. You will also mitigate slightly more damage, undoubtedly. However, if you believe you are going to substantially mitigate more damage and increase your tanking capabilities on attacks that matter, you are wrong. Stacking parry is not reliable and is wasted because of the terrible scaling and so much fluff and magic damage in this game. Ultimately, when it comes down to it, tank mitigation in Final Fantasy XIV comes from cooldowns, not RNG based stats, and I do not like the idea of prioritizing stats with virtually no return. This is a playstyle that I have grown accustomed to, so before you completely reject my crazy theories, I ask you, just try it and see what happens. I've had a lot of positive feedback from big supporters about how incorporating a more aggressive tanking style has worked out for them. I really appreciate the feedback. And you can always think of it this way. Worst case scenario, you die, so no real consequence. However, on the other hand, you might find yourself really enjoying this playstyle. Now, before I get into gear, I want to take a second to rant for a minute, as if my parry block rant wasn't enough. I have noticed a lot of players that tank in Final Fantasy XIV do not think outside the box enough. However, I believe that part of the problem lies with Square Enix's inability to properly inform their players. I think stat weight should either be displayed in detail on your character sheet or when you hover over the stat itself. As players, we should not have to find out all the little minuscule details of stat scaling by performing tedious tests over and over again. So for all of you testers and theory crafters out there, I thank you for your efforts, and they are not wasted. Much respect goes out to you guys. It is a big misconception in this game that tank DPS is not important. That could not be farther from the truth. As a tank, you set the pace of the entire encounter, and, depending on the encounter, you are the only class that has 100% uptime on the boss. It is your responsibility to carry others if need be. If you die, it's over. If your healers are struggling, you need to pop extra cooldowns to compensate. If your DPS aren't pulling their weight or die, it's your job to make up that loss. Tanks have the most responsibility of any class, and you can definitely tell the good ones apart from the bad. Now, about equipment and gear. I won't be adding a Nexus weapon simply because of all the different combinations you could have, and some people may not have the time to get one. So I'll stick with coil gear and tomb gear with set stats. You want the highest item level left side / shield 99% of the time. Now for the shield, I mentioned earlier that block rate versus block strength will not matter unless there is horizontal progression. So for example, you will never use a lower item level shield just because it has more block rate and you think blocking more often is better. That's a terrible idea. Vid and strength are your main stats and you should prioritize them. The only case where a choice of block strength versus block rate should be applicable is when the horizontal progression allows you to do so. Simply meaning that if two shields are the same item level, then choosing between block strength and block rate is completely fine. Starting off with the Burt Gang, RNG has shit all over my group when it has come to Paladin swords. Noctelm, tons of det and crit. High Allegan coat, lots of crit. Knocked gloves, mostly for the accuracy here. High Allegan belt, crit. High Allegan pants, lots of det and accuracy. And knocked boots, lots of det and accuracy on these as well. Now for best in slot accessories. I believe the Paladins benefit more from I-90 Ruby / Topaz more than all of it. Here are the links to the Ruby build and the Topaz one. I have the Ruby just because, you know, I like the skill speed better. But the Topaz one is good as well. You just sub out the Vit for strength. The I-110 Vit accessories only provide an extra 450-ish HP, and as long as you have 7,500 plus HP not in party or food, you are absolutely fine on vitality. With proper mitigation, nothing in the game will be able to kill you, even when solo tanking. The extra strength will also provide more mitigation when you block or parry, and the extra DPS you produce will be noticeable. This will also help you push tight DPS checks much easier. And yes, DPS is a tank's responsibility too. Choosing which Topaz or Ruby I think depends on the group composition. If you solo tank a lot, I would say go with Topaz, because Paladins don't benefit from skill speed like Warriors do. There is no magic number for skill speed on Paladin. If you are going to be tank swapping, go with Ruby because of the skill speed. I always go with Ruby because in my group we tank swap at every opportunity, so both can bring benefits. However, do not be led to believe that the parry on Topaz accessories are going to increase your tanking capability substantially. You might get 1 to 1.5% parry from the whole set, providing 80 total parry, so the whole set doesn't provide much. Well, that finishes part 1 of this guide. I'll start part 2 after this short intermission. Twister, twister.
Hey Riz, can I get a pay on?
Yeah.
No, it's okay.
Only because I died.
No, I'm gonna have invigorate soon.
I'll get first stun.
Okay, I'll get second.
Of course it's me. Oh wait, it's not.
It's me.
When it does that.
Twisters.
I forgot to
Oh
focus.
my god!
Oh my god. And
I
that guy
can maybe
doesn't-
pick him up in time.
He killed you, didn't he?
No, I thought I was moving.
I got you, Xeno. Just provoke.
Oh,
I
hey,
got
we
the
have
lost.
healer LB
It's
soon.
death sentence.
Sorry, Alex.
We almost.
Yo. We have
I'm
healer
gonna heal
LB.
LB. I'm
Yep,
going to
Get
using
in the
it.
middle. Get in the
I
middle before you do
heal
it.
Twister!
Alright,
Oh
you better
my
not miss.
God!
Oh, so good.
Oh my god!
That was great.
Oh,
That was
no.
great.
Holy
Goodness, just
shit!
on me.
Okay guys, now for part 2, abilities, defensive cooldowns, and DPS techniques. So the first thing I want to go over is Sword Oath and Shield Oath. Both are permanent stances that will last until you take them off. Sword Oath increases auto attack potency by 50. This is huge and makes DPSing actually viable. The amount of damage the Sword Oath produces is pretty significant even if it doesn't feel like it. Auto attacks generally make up 30% of the total DPS you will do throughout an encounter, so adding 50 potency to each hit is tremendous. Shield Oath reduces damage taken by 20% while lowering damage dealt by 20% and increasing enmity. This is obviously the oath you will be tanking in, but I'll get into turning this off while tanking later in this guide. Provoke. I still seem to see tanks not fully understanding how to use this move properly. When Provoke is activated, it puts you at +1 higher than the highest threat that has been generated on the target. So be sure to only use Provoke if you are following it up with the second or third hit of your enmity combo, or you run the risk of losing hate after you provoke by someone else's skill. Flash. Flash increases enmity in all nearby enemies. Flash is amazing on Paladin for a couple of reasons. Mostly being because it is your only AoE enmity move, but also because it blinds everything around you, providing even more mitigation. This skill uses MP instead of TP, usable without having a target, and will give you a reason to use Riot Blade, if that's a good thing. I see a lot of tanks use Rage of Halone combo when tanking multiple mobs. That really isn't how Paladins are designed to tank in AoE situations. When there are a lot of enemies, I would say probably 3 or more, or you are speedrunning something, you should really just spam Flash until you're completely out of MP, then Riot Blade, and Flash again, or you run the risk of losing hate on multiple mobs if you're just trying to single target. One thing to note about Flash is that the enmity it generates is based on damage dealt and attack power. I know that sounds weird and the tooltip doesn't exactly say that, but if you activate Fight or Flight while flashing, the aggro Flash produces will be much higher because your damage dealt is higher. Fight or Flight increases damage dealt by 30% for 30 seconds with a 90-second cooldown. This skill is amazing, tons of DPS, so for the most part you'll be using this ability on cooldown. Shield Swipe delivers an attack with a potency of 210, only usable immediately after a successful block. Adds 6-second pacification, costs 40 TP. I really like this ability because it is a slight DPS increase and also conserves TP. The pacification is really nice, but is rarely ever effective because it doesn't work on most bosses. Cover. Take all physical damage for a nearby party member for 12 seconds. Can only be used when the member is closer than 10 yawns. Cooldown is 2 minutes. This move could be a lot better than what it is in my opinion. Only being able to mitigate the physical damage is kind of a letdown. And another problem I have with this skill is that I think the cooldown should be a bit shorter. Overall though, you won't be using this move very much, but when you do, it could definitely save a party member. Spirits Within. Delivers an attack with 300 potency. The potency decreases as HP decreases. It silences for 1 second with a 30-second cooldown. This ability is badass all around. It is off the global cooldown, requires no TP, and hits crazy hard. It also has the utility of silencing the target and acting as an interrupt. Unless you need this skill for the silence, you want to be using this on cooldown for the massive DPS increase. Circle of Scorn. Delivers an attack with a potency of 100 to all nearby enemies, applying a DOT over 15 seconds. The total damage is 250. 30-second cooldown. This is another awesome DPS ability. It is the only AoE ability that does damage. It's off the global cooldown and requires no TP. You'll definitely want to be using this skill on cooldown for a good DPS boost. Okay, now for what makes Paladin amazing, the defensive cooldowns. Normally, while tanking, you want to rotate your cooldowns from shortest to longest. However, in Final Fantasy XIV, I see this is rarely the case outside of activating Rampart first most of the time. A lot of different encounters call for different types of mitigation, so trying to make a cooldown rotation is very tricky because it will not work for all the encounters in this game. I always take encounters on a case-by-case basis, and even sometimes, within the encounter, I take the mechanic damage on a case-by-case basis. I might have confused myself there. Now, Paladin is a pretty simple class to play, and even more so are activating the cooldowns themselves. Paladin's cooldowns allow a lot of room for error. Rampart. Rampart reduces damage taken by 20% for 20 seconds. The cooldown is 90 seconds. This defensive cooldown is amazing and will be your go-to move in terms of mitigation and progression. In a lot of ways, this is my favorite cooldown a Paladin has because of the huge damage reduction it provides on such a short cooldown. You'll definitely want to start your cooldown rotation with this move so that it is back up again in time to fill any gaps in between cooldowns. This move is also good for any type of damage, meaning one massive hit, multiple hits, or multiple massive hits. Convalescence. Increases HP via recovery magic by 30% for self for 20 seconds. The cooldown is 2 minutes. Another awesome defensive cooldown. 30% healing is crazy high. It makes Ad Loquium godly. It also allows your healers to catch up in AoE damage situations by healing you with raid heals instead of focused target. Sentinel. Reduces damage taken by 40% for 10 seconds. Cooldown is 3 minutes. This cooldown is a big one. This is a man's cooldown right here. You'll definitely want to activate this on its own because trust me, you won't need anything else. Sentinel is ridiculous when it comes to mitigation and normally should be used towards the end of your rotation given its long cooldown. Like Rampart, this ability is good for any type of damage. One big hit, multiple hits, or multiple massive hits. Awareness. Nullifies chance of suffering critical damage for 25 seconds. Cooldown is 2 minutes. Okay guys, I'll just say it. This move is terrible. It is not good. So let's all stop pretending that it is and it actually does something. Stop it. Up to patch 2.38, no mechanic damage can crit. When I say mechanic damage again, I mean the signature boss moves like Death Sentence, Dread Tide, Mountain Buster, you know, you get the idea. None of these moves can crit you. The only moves that can crit are auto attacks, and even auto attacks have only between a 5 to 10% chance to crit. So the chances of this move actually doing anything is extremely low, and when it does prevent the crit, it doesn't prevent much. So just activate this ability in between mechanic damage to make yourself feel like you're mitigating more damage. Tempered Will. Immediately cures blind and heavy while preventing knockback and draw-in effects for 10 seconds. The cooldown is 3 minutes. Yeah, this move is pretty useless, honestly. I mean, don't get me wrong, its effects can be helpful, but for the most part, you'll probably forget you even have this ability. I mean, you can always activate this, so you can be lazy on Heaven's Fall or Titan's Landslide. It also works when Leviathan tips the boat, but all those mechanics you should be avoiding anyway. So if you need this ability to clear an encounter, that should be a sign you need more practice on the actual encounter itself. Not to mention the stupid long cooldown of 3 minutes. Bulwark. Increases block rate by 60% for 15 seconds. Cooldown is 3 minutes. Now I'm really not a fan of RNG based cooldowns, however, Bulwark is pretty damn good. 60% is quite the increase, and I would say it is pretty reliable. Ideally, you want to save this cooldown for attacks that hit multiple times like Bahamut's Claw, because that is where it really shines, but it is also good for big single hits as well. It would always pop at least one shitty cooldown with this if possible, just as a failsafe for if RNG completely shits on you and you block nothing. It's gonna be rare when it happens, but it can. This move can be used for one big hit, but it really shines on attacks that hit multiple times. Hollowed Ground renders you impervious to most attacks for 10 seconds. Cooldown is 7 minutes. Now that tooltip, it also kind of says, eat shit, home gang. Nah, but seriously, this skill is the strongest cooldown in the game, hands down. It is not the best cooldown, but the strongest, because there is a difference. Obviously, you can use this ability in a couple of different ways. One being the oh shit situation, things are happening that I don't like kind of thing, or you can plan to use this at a particular part during the encounter. The only problem with doing that is if you happen to use it beforehand, you will have to recalculate how you plan to handle that situation when it comes up. But yeah, Hollow Ground, 2 thumbs up, amazing. Like I said earlier in this guide, I believe that tank DPS is very important, especially in Final Fantasy XIV, because this game is designed for 2 tanks, not 1. You can solo tank a lot of encounters, but it is not optimal unless you're trying to push limits or phases that you can already do with 2 tanks. Tanks have the capability to do tremendous amounts of damage when given the chance, and I don't think a lot of people fully utilize this. There is a big misconception that paladins do no damage, and this could not be farther from the truth. When played correctly, a paladin can do a lot of damage. I want to touch on switching oaths for a second. If you are not tanking as a paladin, your ass better be in Sword Oath. If you're not in Sword Oath when DPSing, you are not only losing a tremendous amount of damage, but you run the risk of pulling off your co-tank and fucking everything up. You have no one to blame but your bad self if this happens. So during a tank swap, you should not be using Rage of Alone combo, but instead use Riot Blade or Fracture as your last hit while tanking. Switch to Sword Oath immediately after the mechanic damage or when it is safe to do so. Do not be caught mid-Savage Blade, then try to finish your Rage of Alone. Not switching to Sword Oath by interrupting your combo is bad all around, and actually less DPS than if you were to finish your full combo. Now, when you switch back to Shield Oath, you must remember that switching will require mana and 1 GCD, so you must plan at least 2 GCDs ahead of time for this and switch back early. This requires a lot more skill than switching to Sword Oath after a tank swap, so please plan accordingly. The last thing you want to do is tank swap it with Sword Oath still on. Turning Shield Oath off. Taboo of the tank world. So ideally, you only want to do this when you are 100% comfortable with the fight, and never during progression. There are a couple of tricks you can do once your familiarity with the fight is high. After achieving a good amount of threat on the target, preferably 3 or 4 Rage of Alone combos, switching on Sword Oath and pop cooldowns to compensate for big attacks. Activating Rampart with Sword Oath is basically having the best of both worlds for 20 seconds, and since you can obviously still block while in Sword Oath, Bulwark acts as a defensive and offensive cooldown at the same time. Shield Swipe will increase your DPS slightly while conserving more TP as well, but keep in mind, the more you use Shield Swipe, the less aggro you will be generating, so I will caution you on the amount of times you use this ability. But yeah guys, that's all I got. This concludes this guide, and thanks for watching. I hope I was able to show you some new things, and like I said earlier, if there's anything I missed or left out, please leave me a comment below or message me in game. I am Xenosis Vex on Sargatanas.